33. Not much justice. Folks, I hope you understand what the problem of evil articulates. And the nice thing about our pal John Hick is that he concisely says that the problem of evil is almost always articulated as a... It's articulated as a dilemma argument. Now, the dilemma argument goes something like this. It says, if God is in fact a being of unlimited perfection, and those perfections are said to be what? Omnipotence, I had this on the board before. Omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. That means all-powerful, all-knowing, or perfectly wise, and perfectly good, or perfectly just. If God is these things, we would say that God would know about suffering. God would know about the suffering in the world, and God would have the ability to remedy the suffering in the world. The problem is God doesn't remedy the suffering. Therefore, God must not be omnibenevolent. Or to state it another way, if God is omnibenevolent, then God would want his children not to live in so much awful suffering. And if God's all-knowing, he would be perfectly aware of it. But his children suffer. Therefore, God must not be all-powerful enough to do anything about it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make this clear. The problem of evil is not a disproof of the existence of God. Even though, if you talk to your average atheist, I would bet her top answer on the board for why she's an atheist is because this world could not have been created by a loving God. Because there's too damn much misery in it. That is one of the main reasons I hazard. Most of the people who I know who are atheists, they say a good, loving God could not have created this world. There's too much misery, too much injustice. As a matter of fact, who are the people who seem to have the best, materially speaking, lives in the world? Yeah. No, I say the most awful human beings. The people who basically think the rules only apply to suckers. People who lie their way into powerful positions. You know the myth of America that hard work is what gets you economic success? I know it's quite the opposite. Most of my life I've worked 60 to 80 hours a week. And I have a crappy house. Well, maybe it's just because I'm a failure. Yeah, I guess I probably am. But anyway, I would also say if God loved me so much, my life would be immeasurably what? If God loved me, my life should be materially better. I wouldn't be constantly worried about winning the love of my loved ones. But I'm constantly trying to win their love. And I'm not able to get their love because I can't what? Because I'm not able to provide for them adequately. Yeah, I'm being autobiographical here just for fun. But in other words, it is not a world suited to decent people living, materially speaking, good, happy lives. Now, of course, I've just kind of gotten to the crux of a major piece of theodicy. What is theodicy, folks? This word is referred to not in the text, but I want you to know it. It is an important piece of the vocabulary of theology. Theodicy refers to attempts to explain that God has reasons for the world being this way. And it almost always appeals to God having a what? Yeah, God's got a divine plan. And the divine plan always suggests that God created the world this way for some kind of greater good or greater purpose. Now, as the skeptic B.C. Johnson puts it, the burden of proof is not on the atheist. Who's got the burden of proof here? The believer is the one who has the burden of proof, because the believer is the one who's saying God's got a plan. Now, if you make the claim that God's got a plan, guess what you just bought? Not just the burden of proof, but the burden of proof means something like this. You should at least have some kind of meaningful account of what God's divine plan is like. Now, B.C. Johnson, that's the skeptical reading. B.C. Johnson says that if you look at the way the world is made up, it doesn't appear that God is a good, loving father, as C.S. Lewis and others have said. It appears that God behaves like this. He says that if God exists, it seems more apt to say that God acts like a bystander. And he gives this analogy. He says, a baby is in a house fire due to no fault of its own. It happens to be in this house where there's a fire. God could save that baby. But guess what? The baby dies miserably in the house fire. If God's all-powerful, God could have saved the baby. If God's all-knowing, God would have known that the baby was there. But God did nothing. This is why he says God doesn't act like a loving father. God seems to act more like a bystander. Now, this is the point at which the believer needs to what? The believer needs to find a way to counter-argue using theodicy. And I don't have time to give you all of the brushstrokes, but I can give you the broad brushstrokes. The textbook talks about the theodicy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And by the way, the theodicy of St. Thomas Aquinas is a very standard Christian theodicy. What he contends is that the overall purpose of God in creating the universe was to do what? He says God's main aim in the creation of things was the spreading of agapic love. Now, in order to spread agapic love, God had to create beings that are capable of what? Love. That's why God created humans. My dog is not capable of love. And remember why Aquinas says only humans are capable of love? Because we have what strange capacity? Yeah. He says God gave us free will. He says love only has meaning if you have the capacity to withhold it. Love only means something if it is a freely made choice. Now, folks, I don't have time to debate this right now. But later on in the course, we will be discussing whether or not it's even reasonable to believe in free will. And if any of you have studied behavioral psychology in another course, you might understand why some of us are a little bit skeptical about the possibility of actual free will. Because I know to at least some extent, I can be explained as a biological machine. I know that at least in one context, I can be explained as a biological machine. I did not choose my genetics. I did not choose my circumstances. And my entire life has been spent being reinforced in various ways. In other words, I have been conditioned to like certain things, dislike other things. I have been conditioned to behave in particular ways and conditioned against behaving in other ways. Now, some of us are cynical as to whether or not we even have free will in this strict sense. But we'll have to leave that open for a moment. But according to most Christian accounts, we possess free will. And this is, as Hick puts it, an important linchpin in the Christian theodicy. Because if human beings do in fact have free will, who can we blame for everything? Humans. St. Thomas Aquinas says, The reason why suffering exists in the world is because humans misuse their free will. Yeah?
Wouldn't the counter-argument be, though, that with free will, then how is God all-knowing and how can he see everything?
Well, yeah. You hear what Mr. Anderson said? There are certain conundrums put forth by even the assertion that we have free will. Some of us wonder if the concept of an all-knowing God is consistent with free will. Because if God literally knows everything, then God knew from the beginning of time. As a matter of fact, before I was born, God knew what about me? And I'm going to be a little funny here, I hope. God knew that my eternity will be spent burning in hell. God knew before I was born that I would be spending an eternity burning in hell. God would have known that the Christians in my life would have turned me away from Christianity because of their hypocrisy, because of their hatred, and also because of their arrogance. Now, as I understand, that's not supposed to be the message of Christianity. But everyone from my parents on down have been so arrogant and cocksure that they had all the answers. And they also contradict themselves. They say we're all sinners, except we believers are less sinners than the rest of you. In other words, God would have known that all this stuff would confront me, and that I would say, this is not a religion that makes sense to me. And God plagued me with this skeptical mindset. I've been a skeptic since I was 5 years old. In other words, I didn't have a choice in the matter. I was asking ministers questions about the problem of evil when I was 7 years old. That's why I happen to believe that this way I am is more this than anything else. I happen to think that there are certain aspects about me that are just hardwired. In other words, I really didn't have much of a what in it. Really didn't have much of a choice in it, if I had any choice at all. But yeah, if God is all-knowing, it begs the question, how is free will really possible? And that's certainly a problem. And if indeed, and here's the way Aquinas puts it. No, the idea is, it doesn't really make any sense to say that you love God if you didn't have any choice one way or another. So God had to give the possibility of us to do what? To turn away from God. Well, guess what? That already presupposes we have free will. But on top of that, it at least suggests that God tolerates what? And by the way, B.C. Johnson says this. It at least suggests that God must at least tolerate evil. And in fact, if anything exists, who made it possible? God did. And this is not discussed by either Hick or St. Thomas Aquinas. And this is because they know it's a bogus argument. Both my mother and my wife's aunt believe this untheological view, that Satan is the cause of all suffering in the world. Well, guess what? That merely passes the buck. The fact is, if there is a Satan, God created Satan. God knew that Satan would turn away from God, but what? But let it happen. Now, of course, this is a strange thing, because on one hand, biblical Christianity says what about God? That God abhors sin in all of its forms. But at the same time, what? God also lets it happen for a greater good. And some of us think that might be at least a slight inconsistency there. Now, John Hick argues, of course, that God willed the fall of man for the purpose of making this possible. B.C. Johnson uses the phrase soul-making, or rather moral urgency, for those of you who have read those pieces. Now, what does soul-making mean? It means something like this. We are not born children of God, according to this view. We are born potential children of God. And take a guess what can help us become children of God. Life's journey, according to this account. In other words, it is the trials and tribulations that befall us that give us opportunities for soul-making. By the way, B.C. Johnson sees this as being inherently self-contradicting. And I'll give you my one-sentence explanation. Basically, soul-making says evil is good and good is evil. Here's why. Every bad thing that happens to me is actually a good thing, according to theodicy. Why? Because it gives me an opportunity to learn lessons to make my soul worthy of God. So in other words, if I were to get cancer right now, according to soul-making, that cancer wouldn't be a bad thing to happen to me. It would be good for it to happen to me. And if our hardships are good things, take a guess what B.C. Johnson says. And this is funny as Hades. What we should do is we should be trying to create as many hardships for people as possible so they can grow their soul. So basically, if I chock somebody in the face and say, well, I'm making you suffer to try to help you to get closer to God. You see, anything can be rationalized as part of the project of soul-making. According to soul-making, take a guess who did a good thing. Hitler. Because remember, what people who cause immeasurable amounts of suffering give a lot of people more opportunities to grow their soul. This is why B.C. Johnson says soul-making eats itself. It is internally contradictory. It basically says all the bad things that happen to you are actually good things. Therefore, when you do evil things, you are doing good. He says, and what kind of sense does that make, man? Have a good one.